This is an event that took place at 29 years old. It is after surgery. This is not one of those operating table near-death situations. This is, um, I was given a surgery on my mouth and throat. It was for a sleep apnea issue. They remove a great deal of tissue. And I mention it only because the one of the hallmarks of that particular surgery, and it's rarely done these days actually, is because it's an extremely painful recovery. Because this is all very nerve-rich tissue, and you have to continue to use it to breathe and to swallow and things like that. So the analogy I was given at the time was this is going to solve the sleep apnea issue, but you're also going to learn what it's like essentially to experience breaking your leg and having to walk on it, for days. Like it's going to be a really, this is the picture that was painted to me. It really was quite accurate. It's mind-bending blackout level pain in the recovery. And I mentioned that again only because it became relevant when I was in the hospital for 4 days. I was let out on the fourth day. I don't know why I was pushed out of the hospital on that day, because I was barely capable of functioning. I was released into the care of my father, who, I'm not a kid. I was a 29-year-old, more or less grown up, but he wanted to watch over me. So he took me out to the family farmhouse, actually. And about 3 or 4 days into his care, so we're now 7 days after the surgery. And on that day, around midday, I simply feel what I would describe as an inner click. I can't describe it more clearly than that, but it was astonishingly clear. And in that moment, it was instantaneously clear that the life force in me was beginning to drain away. My body was beginning to die, which I'll explain more in a moment, like what was actually causing that. But there were sort of three things that flooded in kind of simultaneously in that moment of recognizing that click and recognizing that the body was beginning to die. The first of them was simply that, in a way I'd never seen before quite so clearly, there was a recognition that I wasn't my body, that there was an observing, aware consciousness that was aware that the body was dying, aware of what was going on, aware as it usually is, normally has been. It was just that it was seen that it was so clearly distinct from the physical form itself, that the body was dying, but that non-bodily conscious awareness was itself not dying. In fact, even though the body was dying, that aware consciousness wasn't affected in any way whatsoever at all. And that was profoundly meaningful in that moment, because what it meant more than anything else immediately was that the mind-bending blackout level pain in that body was no longer relevant to that consciousness. It was a complete release from the suffering of the pain. It didn't mean even that the pain itself was gone. The pain in the body was there just as it had been. It's just that it didn't need to be attached to. I didn't need to tell a story about it. It didn't in any way affect this aware consciousness. So it was the first time, it was not the last by any means, but it was the first time I saw the difference between pain and suffering. Pain's still there, but the suffering is zero. So a complete release. And that immediately affords a kind of freedom that is astonishing. The second thing immediately, I say them sequentially, even though it was all sort of simultaneous. The second awareness was that life force was ebbing away rather slowly. That it wasn't, that I had some time, and that it was, I was going to be able to sort of watch and observe and experience this ebbing away of that life force. And it was just a guess in that moment, but it was like, I think I probably have 2 days or something like that. I got some time, and that was a great comfort, partly because the sort of revelation of that release from the suffering and release into that freedom was so arresting that there was a part of me that just reveled in the thought that I had time to spend with it. Oh, this is fantastic. I want to say really clearly, it was the opposite in every possible way, saying, oh no, I'm dying. Um, it was, I'm dying. This is extraordinary. This is fascinating. This is so engaging. This is marvelous. Which turned every idea I could have held about what death and dying meant completely upside down. But none of those two things, those two things together, kind of were blown away even by the third sort of recognition that, again, sort of all floods in simultaneously. But that third recognition was that the even that individuated but non-bodily sense of awareness, sense of consciousness, was itself beginning to dissolve. It was losing its individuality. It was as though every iota, every molecule of life force that left, then in an equal measure, there was the experience that that individuatedness was dissolving into, and this is the best descriptions I can come up with. It's one of those things that's very difficult to put into words, but it was the sense of my individual sense of self dissolving into absolute allness. And that conferred a sense of freedom that was even greater than merely being released from the suffering, or merely being released from the idea that I was this body or contained in this body, or that this body had even anything to do with that sense of being, that fundamental being. And the reason it blew it away was that if one is dissolving into absolute allness, then there's no way to lose anything, because it literally is absolutely all. And if there is no way in whatsoever that there is a sense of loss in any way, then how can there be any sense of fear? There could not be. So this is an experience of the absolute impossibility of there even possibly being the experience of lack or want or need or suffering. And if none of those things are possible, again, how could there really be any fear? There couldn't. There wasn't. And so I couldn't possibly view any of this as a problem. I'm dying. This is amazing. I can't believe how much I love it. I mean, I put it that way almost just to make it sound absurd. What it made was that it made the old framework seem to be absurd. There could not possibly be a sense of loss. And if you dissolve into what's absolutely all, it's extremely whole. It's missing nothing. So there couldn't possibly be any fear. And so when my father came in the room, as he did periodically during all of these days, he'd sort of pop in every few hours, like, how's Jonathan doing? Does he need anything? And I'm well aware that my body was dying, but there's not even an impulse to try to communicate this. I look at my father come in the room. I feel tremendously loving towards him. That's all. There's no sense of there being a problem, something that's wrong, that needs to be communicated, or anything of the sort. It is a very literal experience of, if I were to quote an old-timey popular source, it was the peace that passes all understanding. I couldn't imagine how to explain this to him. So I didn't try. There was no impulse there was no need for it. There was no sense of need of I need to explain it. And so if there's no fear, we've all often heard that the opposite of fear is love, or the opposite of love is fear. If there cannot be fear, then it's something loving and essentially peaceful is sort of the automatic default setting. And so that is precisely where I was. And in that sense, everything was perfectly fine the way it was. Full stop. So I said nothing. And I smiled lovingly and peacefully at my father. And I thought, this is amazing. And even if I wanted to, I couldn't communicate this to him. I don't know how I would put this into words. For the record, it took a very long time to do that at all. But we'll come back to it. The rest of the afternoon was spent essentially in a state of absolutely awestruck peace. I did very little other than stare out windows, and look at the world around me in awestruck peace. And eventually, I can still, every moment I check in, it's like feeling the mercury receding in a thermometer. Like the life force is draining away. I also discover I feel tired. And after nearly a week of just blackout level pain, I haven't really slept much. Comes this moment where I think, wow, the suffering's gone. I think I could sleep. That sounds terrific. I think I'll give it a shot. And so I just go to bed and I wake up periodically through the night. And every time I wake up, I check in. Am I still dying? Yes, it's speeding up now. I can feel it speeding up. The body is slowing down. That life force is ebbing away faster. There's still some time. But with every, again, molecule that life force falls away, there is an equal and growing experience of merging with the infinite, of merging with what is all, merging with what is unequivocally whole and complete and contains absolutely everything. And I wake the following morning in the same state. I spend the following day in the same state. During that day, there's some additional things that sort of arise, and it arises in a way that I'm not sure I can even say much more about how or why. It just arose. And it was a thought like, I can see very clearly today that there is sort of a threshold. If I go far enough down this road, there is no going back. In other words, I will get to the part where the body is laid aside completely. And that presents itself as a choice, a very clear choice, and a very easy choice. Like there's no effort in it. It is as easy as a thought. Like there's nothing about it that has to do with merits or intention or effort or anything. It's just like, if I want to go that way, I go. If I don't, I can make that choice also. And so I get to revel in the question for a little while, like, well, why wouldn't I go that direction? This is the experience of the most all-encompassing peace I could possibly have imagined. I couldn't have imagined it without coming to this experience in time. Why wouldn't I go in that direction? There's nothing wrong with it in any way. So why not merge into the absolute vastness of all-encompassing peace? It's a pretty good question. And I don't really, certainly at the time, I did not understand, in a way I still don't, why something arose in me that simply said, I think I'm not going to cross that threshold. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to go quite that far. I think I'm going to stay here. And it's really close. Like it really, like 51% I'll stay, 49 I'm happy to go. But it arises in a way that is something like, I think there's something, I think there's things I need to do here. I'm not quite done here. But at that time, at 29 years old, I also thought, I don't even know what those things are. I have no idea, really. I mean, it sounds great and purposeful, but I had no idea at that time. And so to have that impulse arise with such clarity, to turn away from that, struck me as sort of surprising, curious. But I did come to a point that following day where I just thought, I think I'm not going to go all the way. And soon thereafter, again, one of those instances where my father comes in the room, but this time it's different. And he looks at me funny and he says, I think something's not right, Jonathan. I think we should load you up and we're going to go back over to the hospital. It's a 2-hour drive. We're way out in the country. And I'm not in any hurry whatsoever. I've not explained any of this to him. For the record, I also can't speak very well. There was a great deal of, surgical procedure had been done to my throat. So I can eke out some whispered words, but that's about it. And I just take forever, but we eventually load up and go. And that evening, we're at the hospital, the original hospital that the surgery had been conducted in. The ER docs quickly determine I am in fact dying, and I'm dying for the dumbest reason. It is the dumbest reason of all of medical science, pretty much. I'm dying from dehydration, and when you've had all this done to the throat and the whole thing, so. I had essentially eaten and drank so little that my body's dying from dehydration. And so that also means that the fix is very simple. They poke an IV bag into my arm with saline solution into it and immediately drain 1.5 liters salt water in them. And is the instant that they connect that saline solution, I feel these processes reverse. I can feel that merging into the infinite has begun to reverse. I can feel that life force beginning to flow back in. And it's very clear that I am, in fact, coming back from that threshold. And in that moment, that seems, again, it's an interesting question to say, well, what does it feel like to turn away from the brave, most all-encompassing peace that you could imagine? What does it feel like to turn away from that? And the answer was, in that moment, it felt right, because the decision had already been made. I think I'm going to stay. And so the fact that that life force was flowing back in just felt like kind of a happy extension of that decision, even though I still couldn't fully understand it at the time either. This seems a little crazy to turn away from, but in fact, I can look at this world around us now and realize even more clearly that there's a lot of ways in which it is full of chaos and mayhem. Why would you come back here? And yet it was the choice that was made. And so to actually be doing it seemed like the fulfillment of what was right and good. So I was very content. It is only at this point that my father realizes that I had actually that I was dying. So he's starting to feel quite good about the situation. He's quite glad we came to the hospital, that sort of thing. And they keep us for a little while to observe. I'm fine. They let us go late that night. We take another 2-hour drive back. And immediately my recovery from this entire ordeal also speeds up. It turns out that being extremely dehydrated makes it difficult for your body to heal. But that's no longer going to be an issue. And I heal up quickly. And 3 weeks from that day, I return to my own home. I go back to my job at the time, and I just return to regular life. There's lots of questions I often get asked about these things, these experiences, and one of them is, well, that must have changed your life. How did it, what happened when you returned? It must have been completely different. And I can verify that that was not so. It took a long time. The fact is that the minute I got back to the office, I couldn't figure out how to reconcile what I knew that I knew and had seen what I'd seen and experienced what I had experienced. And I could not reconcile it with having to rush to the office a little bit late, chewing on a breakfast sandwich in my car through traffic and thinking, oh my God, this is so important. Because it did seem important in that moment. And his body went from seeming like, frankly, meaningless sack of sand that I really didn't have much of an investment in at all. It seemed, it came back to feeling like it was very important. And yet there was a part of me that, again, knew what I knew, had seen what I'd seen, experienced what I'd experienced, and just I couldn't reconcile those experiences very well. And so what I did is bury that experience. I was often asked, oh, hey, how'd it go? You had surgery. Hey, I heard you almost died. Oh, yeah. And I could tell them a dramatic story. And I universally left out the merging into the infinite part because I couldn't figure out how to put that into words. And I couldn't manage to look anyone in the eye and say, you, all of us, that feeling that we have that this body is so important, that that's who we are, that's what we are, that's where we are, that's what we reside in, that's what makes us us. Yeah, it's not nearly as true as you think. In fact, it's not actually true at all. And I couldn't figure out how to say that to anyone with a straight face. And so I said nothing. For what it did do, however, privately, was it turned me into much more of what you would have to call a spiritual seeker. Because it set up within me essentially sort of a drive to reconcile what I couldn't seem to reconcile. And how do I understand this experience and match it with walking around in everyday life here? And we could unpack that a great deal. But in my case, it took a decade to really begin to crack that open. And it was a decade that included a wide range of other experiences we could call spiritual experiences. It also included a lot of experiences that had to do with death and dying. And I think the most, one of the more powerful of them was 10 years after this event, I find myself faced with my father on his deathbed. And he's hooked to a bunch of machines that are keeping him alive. There were two things about it that forced me. There were many other events that also forced me to reconcile with my own experience, but this was a particularly powerful one in which he was actually unconscious, but every time I whispered into his ear that there were family members coming, I would watch the machines that he was hooked to and the monitors and the heartbeat and the blood oxygen level and all of it. And all the vital signs, whenever I whispered into his ear, they would level off or they would rise a little bit. They would essentially improve a little. And it reminded me that even in his state of complete unconsciousness, that it appeared that there was some power in him that was given to choice. And every time I whispered into his ear, something in that bloated unconscious body appeared, at least, to choose to hang on a little bit longer. And I could see it on the vitals. After a little while, those vitals would begin to erode again. I'd whisper something else into his unconscious ear, and they would rise again. And that went on all afternoon until the rest of my family members. But towards the end of that day, something else took place, which was my stepmother, who was sort of, as one would sort of expect, was sort of in charge of his state of affairs. And she's a very well put together, very powerful woman. And it's one of the only times I'd ever seen her fall completely apart. In fact, it's the only time. And at the very end, she came to me in tears and said, "I can't do it. You have to do it. You have to do this, Charles." And I knew in that instant that it had fallen on me to have the responsibility to tell those doctors when to unplug the machines. I don't know if I could come up with a more cinematic moment in which I would be forced to reconcile with my own experience than this. I don't know how life could have served up anything more powerful than that. And so, yeah, I mean, this was one among many other experiences. But it took a decade for all these things to marinate. And it took experiences like this with my father to sort of force me back in touch and force me to reconcile with what I knew that I knew. And I felt in that moment with him like it was a tremendous honor to end up in that role. I had to admit that there was nobody else in the room that had the kind of experience that I had had and could bring to that moment. And for that, I felt deeply, deeply honored that decision with him fell to me. I felt incredibly honored. And I also knew that the journey he was going to be going on was going to be one of astonishing beauty. And there was no way that I could make that final choice and tell those in charge to unplug the machines without having some awareness that was going to be something he would experience in a way that was unexpressibly beautiful, and that there was a way in which it would be the opposite of any kind of fear, or that there's a way in which, and every one of us is a little different. Like, my experience is not necessarily precisely what someone else's experience is going to be. That's very well documented. There are so many NDE stories out there these days. All of them are a bit different. What I would hasten to say about that is that all of us in our individuality, when we come to these kind of junctures in our journey, we are in fact going to experience it in some way that's unique to our makeup. Yes. But there's also some ways that there's sort of an underlying content, or there's underlying themes that seem to stretch across almost all of our experiences. Those often include things that encompass tremendous peace and lovingness, and they take a different form for every person. Sometimes, for instance, people talk about the tunnel and the light at the end of it, and the loving family members that they meet, or some other version of something like that. Why? Is it because that's a fundamental reality of what's happening? I don't see it that way. It's not from my own experience. I see it as that we experience these things in the form that is meaningful to us. And so if love is most embodied to someone by those particular family members, well, that's who they're probably going to see, because it's that form in which they can most understand that love. So of course, that's the form in which they get to experience it. And so to me, is in the end, these matters of form begin to lose meaning. It's the underlying content that ties these things all together in terms of that underlying lovingness, that underlying encompassing peace, the underlying vibration, if you will, of the lack of fear. That's something that could take a vast, infinite number of forms. And so we all get to have different, infinitely different experiences. Nobody gets to avoid the truth with a capital T forever, which I say in the sense of it being extraordinarily and beautifully good news. So, yeah, there's a lot to unpack. But this near-death experience didn't change my life immediately at all. I couldn't manage that. It had to marinate, and I needed a whole bunch of other experiences to really embody what I knew what I'd experienced. And there did come a point, soon after my father's passing, actually, where that encompassing piece felt like it kind of settled in. I can sincerely say that even though the slings and arrows of life still fly, there's a way in which that encompassing piece is still always at the it's always at the bedrock. It's always the substrate upon which everything else seems to happen. And it doesn't mean that I've gotten to live a perfect life. It's a very human life, but there is a way in which there came a point that it's that piece settled in a way that seems sort of permanent and is never ultimately left. And it is that moment, years after that NDE, that is really the most pivotal, life-changing experience I've actually ever gone through, much more than the NDE itself. It's sort of as though the truths and the experiences contained or previewed in that NDE came to a point where they settled in a way that were visceral and permanent instead of ephemeral and in and out. And it is a little difficult to put that into words, but peace is certainly the fruit of it.
You said you didn't talk about your experience, you didn't share it with people, but you sort of become more spiritual, you became more interested in this other reality. Was the moment after your father's passing, when you discovered this peace again, was that the moment where you thought you wanted to talk about it?
A wonderful question. No, that it settled. It was a number of months after his passing. I sent myself on my own retreat, kind of a self-directed retreat for actually a bunch of months. And it was during that time when that shift came my way, but in a way that was very, very similar to that click when I discovered my body was dying. In that moment of awareness, now many years later, during that retreat, the awareness of that peace still didn't foster at all. In fact, it was very much the opposite of fostering the, oh, I gotta tell people feeling. It was again like the feeling that it was embodied in was simply that everything is fine the way it is. Like really, to the point that even the impulse to try to express this is absent. There was no, it's in that way that it was extraordinarily quiet and extraordinarily peaceful. Like, there was no impulse to even say anything about it. Um, the phrase that I fell in love with at that time was silence seemed the best vessel for holding it. And I also had the experience that when I did want to try to put it into words, words felt impossibly useless to try to really convey. They weren't adequate. They weren't up to the task. And so to try felt very hollow. I was far more likely to just want to sit quietly and let that quietude speak for itself. It's a funny way to put it, maybe, but it's why. And again, and I don't mean to get too far afield or off topic or something like that, but it it began. There began to be, well, a couple things. One is that I spent the next year and a half literally almost silent. It's a very strange way to be a functioning grown up, but I really just stopped talking. I had been on this, I'd sent myself on a retreat. I was actually in a little Guatemalan village for 3 months. And I'm not even in the village, but like on a hillside, anyway, the details don't matter. But um, I came back I came back home to Seattle, and I knew immediately when I got back, there's no way I could return to regular life. I wasn't, nothing about the old life seemed like it made any sense. I never did return fully to it. And I actually stayed, I almost didn't talk for over a year. And it was out of that sense of silence was the best vessel for holding it. I mean, it was an absolute joy. And eventually, eventually the sort of normal pattern of, engaging with the world and talking as a functioning grown up does came back to some extent, but it still didn't ever return to the way it was fully before, in a way that's a little hard to put into words. But um, the it's also a period when, after that really silent period, when sometimes people they would want to, they liked, there was a there was a way in which sometimes people did sort of respond to that stillness or that quietude, like it did tell them of itself in a way. And so it it's what eventually turned into a trickle of people that would come to me and want to talk or just want to sit, or that sort of thing. And there was a lot of healing things that happened, and a whole range of things kind of opened up in me that I hadn't anticipated in terms of intuitive, what's often called intuitive abilities and healing things. Again, that seems like it might be a whole other subject, but um, it 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 did become that. I mean, that quiet center ultimately became sort of at the heart of how I operated in the world, and worked with whatever came towards me, and whether it was um, just regular life events or people or whatever. And maybe it's one of the reasons that people come to listen to NDE videos sometimes, or um, approach things like this at all. If there's a touch of that quietude or a touch of that stillness, or a touch of that grace that can find its way to anyone through what we're doing tonight, then I can't really imagine a better purpose for it. I suppose it's possible that, that sort of eventually, if I had to go all the way back to that question, like, well, I think I'm going to stay here because there's some things I should be doing. I can't really imagine a better one than what you and I are doing right now. I can't really imagine, I can't really imagine there being a better use of my time, you know, than doing something like this today. And with others, sometimes when they reach out to me or what have you. One of the things that's wonderful, and I realize it's a strange thing to say out loud in the world most of the time, but one of the things that's really wonderful about the subject of death and dying is that it tends to get people to go really deep and get really real, real fast. It's marvelous for that. It's extraordinary. It's fantastic. And so in a way that is unlike many other pathways, it gives people an opportunity to bump right up close to not only questions, but experiences that show them something about the truth of who they really are at their deepest essence. And it's impossible for me to imagine that as anything other than the highest brilliance. And so that feels like an honor to be a part of that in some way. And again, sort of like, well, I could do other things with my time, but might as well be doing things like this. And it's kind of the only thing that makes any real sense to me. It, one of the wonderful things about touching those deeper places is that I believe this is sort of a fundamental part of the nature of our humanity, not unique to anyone, is that when we touch those deep, deep, deep parts of our humanity, that magic tends to spread. Like, what I mean is that it becomes almost impossible. Sabrina, if you think even in your own experience where you've had those kinds of moments where something deep in you moved a little, and you knew it and you felt it, and there was something about it that felt right and good. And maybe not to everyone all the time, but there's a way in which it's almost impossible for you not to bring that with you into many, many, many of the other interactions you have, whether they seem trivial or meaningful. Like wherever you go, you bring that with you now. In fact, you can't not bring it with you. And so it tends to spread. That's one of the great beauties. It's one of the ways that, when any of us as human beings let something go and we relax a little bit and we become a little freer, even if it's in some small way, it's essentially impossible that we don't then automatically share that little bit of freedom with the world around us. Going to come out one way or another. That's one of the great beauties. So it is this sort of upward spiral that is only natural. Even if it's calling the plumber. Hey, it still doesn't have to seem like a big deal, and you still just got to call the plumber. Sometimes calling the plumber just seems nicer than it did before.
I haven't had that experience just yet, but we'll see.
I'm quite confident it's coming your way.
You said you spent a year or more than a year in silence. And I know this is, for most of us, something that is extremely difficult to actually do in practice. So I have two questions about that. The first one was, what drove you to seek out such an experience? What was the reasoning behind it? And the second one was, what did you take from that experience? What did you learn?
All right. So what drove it? Well, I was not driving it. It felt more as though it descended upon me. It was not something that I was trying to do, sought to do, or thought that I should do because of some benefit that would accrue. It was simply that I'd gone through this shift in which, let me back up once more. So one of the aspects of that near-death experience that I tried to describe was even that sense of individuated sense of self merging into this allness, losing its individuality, if you will. I want to return to that because what's at the heart of that experience is essentially the recognition that individuated small sense of self showed itself to not really had essentially an illusory quality to it. It was essentially a sort of formed out of a web of beliefs, and that it's sort of like those beliefs being seen through. Well, you can't hold that web together any longer. And in that sense of an individuated sense of self, this would be true of anyone going through something like this. And that sense of individuatedness would sort of begin to fade or be seen through or seen to be not true. And if that individuated sense of self isn't so, then there isn't something there to be separate. And so again, it's sort of like when you take away fear, the default setting is love. When you take away that sense of individuatedness, there's nothing there to be separate. So the default setting becomes allness. it's a it's a it's a bit poetic to try to wrap your head around that, perhaps at least in a conceptual way. But the reason I'm mentioning it is that in that shift many years later, that silence essentially felt as though it descended because all the noise that was associated to that individuated sense of self kind of left with that sense of an individuated self. It's sort of like saying all the baggage and noise and stories and all the noise that's associated with that, if that individuated self isn't so true, then none of the baggage attached to it is either. And that means if it's going, all the noise quiets down, or at least the vast majority of its noise, you know? And so there was simply a sense of quietude without a secondary sense of need of anything. Like, I don't need, there's no sense of need. There's no individuated sort of egoic sense of, hey, I got to wave my flag. Well, wait a minute. There's no one there to wave the flag in the first place. What? There's no need to wave the flag. So there is no flag waving. That's why it's really quiet. There's no sense of needing to shout or even say a dang thing. In fact, the one who would have been doing the talking it's like it all dries up and blows away. And so there was no sense of an individuated self seeking quiet. It was just quiet because that individuated sense of self had mostly entirely dissolved. So the default setting is quiet. In fact, it seemed very, very awkward to try to kick it back into motion. And over time, it sort of revealed itself that you don't kick it back into motion. That it kind of comes back into motion if that's what the universe dictates. Here's a way of describing one of the grand results of all of these experiences. Like, if you're asked a question like, what are you taken from all these experiences? One way of answering that question would be to say, individual egoic sense of self was shown to be an absolute fiction, and not just shown, but experienced quite directly. And what that leaves then is less of an egoic decider to decide all the things and make all the choices and do all the stuff. And so what opens up is this opportunity to listen, essentially, to listen to that inner prompt, to listen to the still small voice within you, might say, listen to guidance, listen to divine movement, listen to every culture on earth has their own words for this. But it's listening to that inward spirit, the movement of spirit, beginning to be more and more directed by it. And so how did the words sort of kick back into gear? It's not because I decided to talk. It's because there was that inward sense of direction that this is, that sort of divine direction is a divine prompt. That spirit is like, okay, do this. This is fine now. It's time for this. These people are talking to you. It's time you talk back. And it just sort of goes of its own accord. So one way of describing this entire journey is one in which it was going from a place of being enveloped completely in the egoic, individuated sense of having to make choices, decisions, and force things into being, to listening very carefully to the direction spirit. That's one way of encompassing this entire journey. I wasn't so much of a listener before, but through all of these things, it was as though listening to that became the only real, not only that, but the only one that was riddled with joy. Nobody's perfect, for the record. There are still ups and downs. Listening to that inner prompt is one way of describing this whole journey.
What struck me was that it sounds as though at various points in your journey that you've let yourself indeed be led by this, by spirit, by where it's taking you, and you've let yourself be guided. Were you like this and before your spiritual experiences? And If not, was it difficult to surrender?
Yes. Um, I think there were ways that I came into this life that were a bit primed for some of these things, but I also came into this life very, it was both to such a degree. I can look back way back, I mean, to my earliest memories and find little precursors in ways that line up with some of these later experiences in a way that makes sense to me. But I also look back and can see how overwhelmingly I ignored um, all of this. You know, how that powerfully individuated sense of self was very invested in driving the ship. And another way of describing this whole journey is having to encounter that resistance and encounter that ego, that sense of self, over and over and over and 12,000, a million times, and encounter it again and again and again, and have these things sort of broken down a little further and a little further and a little further. And here's a big experience that really, shook the tree, and yet still, you know, would be enveloped in that very ordinary ego and sense of self where no, 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 it has to be, it's up to me. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I still learn that lesson every single day, actually. Like there's a way it comes back always. If I look at myself as a young person and someone whispered into my ear and said, hey, here's some things that are going to happen to you and some experiences that you're going to have, I wouldn't have believed those. I mean, I would have said, that sounds stupid. That sounds absurd and ridiculous, and that's nonsense. Even it, I had a long ways to go, but there also comes a point where, when you have those kinds of direct experiences, it's like it cracks your head open. Like you can't not pay attention. It's like when you've been shown that there's more to the story over and over and over, pretty soon you have to go, it looks like there's more to the story here. And now I've learned enough and seen enough that I can't turn away from it. I'm a little bit fascinated now. And the more I go in this direction, the more it draws me and the more I feel pushed. Um, that's, that's what we would call in the spiritual marketplace that often falls under intention and willingness. And those are powerful. And they're powerful because they tend to bring to people the kinds of experiences that show them that what they're suspicious is true actually is true. And so, yeah, if a conversation like this in some small way encourages someone else out there to follow that prompt within themselves, that's enough. Even if it doesn't mean that that person turns around and immediately has some mind-bending, life-altering experience, it's enough because when they turn ever so slightly in the direction of truth with a capital T, it means they're oriented in the right direction. And that essentially guarantees the destination. We don't know what their timing may be, but it still guarantees the destination. They'll be fine. It's going to sort itself out. So it doesn't always take giant experiences. For most people, most of the time, including me, it's more like thousands and thousands and thousands of small moments that erode that stone like water over stone over the while. That's how it is most of the time. That's all right. That's about the right pace for most of us most of the time. So that's good.
So, Jonathan, tell me more about the work that you do and how can people find you?
So anyone is welcome to find me at my website and write me. So far, I have a track record of writing everyone back. I keep to that as much as I possibly can. I have a website at assistthespirit.com. They can find various articles I've written and videos and things like that. If they've enjoyed what we've talked about today, I'm sure it's a place that people would find something else that they would appreciate and value. Sometimes people want to work with me one-on-one. I do that a lot. Sometimes I go wherever I'm invited to heal and work with people and all that sort of thing. That healing work is grounded deeply in some of the things that we've spoken about today, in the sense that there, it's a it's a way of connecting in which that fundamental underlying oneness just sort of rises up a little bit. And when that's experienced by someone else, they tend to experience it in a way that's meaningful to them or accessible to them or acceptable to them. And that takes a vast array of forms. It takes as many forms as there are people. But it's often cast in terms that are very healing. Anyway, come find me at assistthespirit.com or look up Jonathan Van Valin.